Hello and welcome to a special Halloween edition of Writer to Writer. I'm your host, Kat Filer, also known as KJ Filer, and my guest today is Del Blackwater, author of Dead Egyptians. Happy Halloween, Del. Your book, Dead Egyptians, is the perfect tie-in for fans of All Hallows Eve.
Thank you. I mean, I certainly hope so. For a book about dead Egyptians, I squeezed as many dead Egyptians as I could into the book. Halloween is my favorite holiday. Ironically, for a book about dead Egyptians, there's no mummies in it at all. However, it haunted me, right? And so in book two, there are mummies, and I fixed the problem eventually. But in this one, God, I mean, Egyptology is so expansive, right? I couldn't
Yeah.
cover it all in book one. This is book one of seven. So book one is very much focused on ghosts.
Um, so your story is also really it's very full of enchantment, but it's also got a lot of custom history, culture. I think it has a really broad fan base, and I think fans of historical fiction would love this book too.
Yeah, I mean, all writers have to struggle with what genre their book is. I didn't even know if I was going to be allowed to pick my own genre.
Yeah.
So I had 8 years to think about it. That's another story. But I knew all along the choices were I could be historical fiction, I could be paranormal fiction, or I could be gay fiction.
Okay.
And I knew all along that I belonged in sci-fi fantasy. I knew if you walk into Barnes and Noble, you should find me in sci-fi fantasy next to Neil Gaiman, next to Lev Grossman, my heroes. The book is so expansive, right? It's the protagonist is gay, but it's not about that. It's
Right.
about those aspects of ancient Egypt, which we should still be talking about. So it's extremely fantastical. And then in terms of is it paranormal fantasy or is it historical fantasy, it fits cleanly into both, right? We've
Yeah.
got ghosts walking around dead splaining things, and I would have loved to have the goths on board and just call it paranormal fantasy, and that might have been more commercially viable. But it has to be historical fantasy to me because in the course of these seven books, I'm covering the rise of Egyptian nationalism, leading to Egyptians kicking out the British and the French, which they will do in exactly 20 years. Book one opens in 1902. In exactly 20 years, they actually kick out Britain and France for good.
Wow. So
Yeah,
they've been
so
casting around for their own um, native government.
yes, exactly. So simply because there was so much research involved in the book, I am an Egyptologist. Um, I sort of felt a compulsion to call it historical fantasy, but it's many things.
I think increasingly books are cross genre.
Mm,
So I think that's a good thing. I know that it frustrates librarians and bookstore owners because they don't want to, they don't know what
right.
shelf to put it on.
Right. I said to my publisher, you and I are published with the same publisher, Black
Yeah,
Rose. And they're like, what genre are you? And I was like, oh, historical fantasy. And and I didn't know what happens after that point. It turns out it doesn't matter.
yeah,
I'm indie. It's not like my book is in Barnes and Noble at the moment.
yeah.
Also, Amazon is going to do whatever it wants.
That's right.
Amazon takes it and they go, "Oh, you think you're a certain thing, don't you? Well, we know what you are. You're this now."
Yeah,
Amazon calls me uh queer fantasy, which apparently,
interesting.
yeah.
Well, sometimes a niche works too, although I think this has a much broader audience than that. But yeah, I think that's interesting. And I don't
Yeah.
think it's a bad thing. So, let's go back and talk a little bit about the actual book. How much of the magic that exists in the world of dead Egyptians actually comes from ancient Egypt?
A shocking amount. Um Egyptology is a huge field. I could not possibly squeeze in all of the interesting tidbits, like I said, but um, let's at least tackle the afterlife because that is largely what's covered in book one. So, in ancient Egypt, according to their religion, if you die, you end up in the Hall of Judgment. there are 42 commandments in the ancient Egyptian religion, right?
Okay.
42. You are expected to make negative confessions to these assessors. Each commandment is personified by a being, and the being will say to you, "So, did you lie?" And you say, "I did not lie. I did not steal. I did not covet my neighbor's oxen," whatever the commandment is, right? Negative confessions. Then, when that's all done, you get to a lot of people know about this aspect of the afterlife. You get to the scale where the feather of truth is one half of the scale. On the other half of the scale is your heart, and they weigh them. And if you are honest, you will be lighter than the feather of truth because you were telling the truth. And
Okay.
if you were not honest, the reverse of that situation. So basically, according to them, let's say you're so nauseatingly good in life that you can actually say you didn't break any of these 42 commandments. And believe me, these are very specific commandments. Like one of them is, are you witty? Do you
Okay.
sometimes say things that are witty instead of wise? Right? Okay, so let's say you're that good. You're telling the truth. You become what is called a sahu, which is an immortal being. If you are pretty good, they'll send you to purgatory because it's called a menti. If you're pretty good, but you need to think about certain things and admit to certain things within yourself, you'll be in a menti for however long it takes to come to terms with whatever it was that you didn't quite nail.
Okay.
Yeah.
So what happens to the really bad people?
Oh, right. The bad people. I've been told that dead Egyptians is terrifying, which I don't agree with, but there are definitely consequences for sinning in ancient Egypt, and they're harsh. So if you were a very, very bad person, like you're unredeemable, like they can't use you,
Okay.
your personality is going to cease to exist, and it happens at that scale that we were talking about. If you're rotten, unredeemably rotten, the creature called Amit, the eater of hearts, will devour your heart, which I believe was a metaphor for your soul is actually getting eaten.
Okay.
However, there's something in between where if you're moderately bad, they're going to send you back to Earth to reincarnate. So it looks like you fall into the waters of forgetfulness or the waters of chaos. You remember nothing of any of your previous lives. You reincarnate uh, and you start over.
So you're telling me I was a moderately bad person because I'm still here?
So, yeah, I mean, according to their way of thinking, if you're on Earth, you are a moderately bad person that needs to start over, or there is an exception. Maybe this is you, I don't know. Um, if you were a Sahu, you were an immortal, you passed all the tests, you became this godlike being. You could have chosen to come back to Earth as a helper spirit because
Oh,
Egypt needed you or the world needed you or whatever. And so that's a good lead in to the actual story of dead Egyptians, which is that my protagonist, his name is Albion Stanley, he's one of those. He's the latter. He was a Sahu. He passed all the tests. He did really good. And he chose to come back even though he didn't have to because Egypt needed him and they were out of ideas. And he thought, maybe I can do more good down there because I will be able to see the dead Egyptians. I will be able to speak to them. And so between y'all and me, we can fix this. So
okay.
he,
Okay. And Albion always reincarnates into a ruling class, although in this case he's not Egyptian in this story, not by, well, nationally by birth. He is in his soul, but he always reincarnates into a ruling class, correct?
Right. Right. So in this book, he is British because the British are running the show right now. Before that, he was French. Before that, he was an Ottoman. Before that, a Mameluke. Before that, an Arab. Before that, a Byzantine. Before that, a Roman. Um, Albion is in a reincarnation cycle, right? They have a mission. They want to restore native rule. It's been 2,000 years since Egyptians ruled Egypt. Um, and he's going to do whatever it takes. And right now, they're kind of lost. That includes the living Egyptians and the dead Egyptians. They don't really have a good plan for how to restore native rule because they've been at this a long time and nothing that they have tried has worked. So
Okay.
they're starting from scratch.
Does Albion, well, now Albion has no memory of who he was, but does he have some idea of what he should be doing?
Well, he sees the dead Egyptians, of course, and they will fill him in. So he can't remember his past lives. But as soon as he starts talking to the dead Egyptians, they'll be like, hey, your destiny is in Egypt. Come back to Egypt. Also, you're stuck in a reincarnation cycle. Also, we're trying to restore native rule. And they get him up to speed.
Okay. And how will he know when he's reincarnated? It seems unfair to him. How does he find out what he's supposed to do next time?
Well, there's two conflicts in the series, and they're unrelated to each other. One conflict is restoring native rule. That's everybody's conflict. But then Albion has his own conflict. So in theory, in 1922, they'll do it, right? They will restore native rule. That's not going to help Albion break his reincarnation cycle, though. They he volunteered to come back. What he did not understand when he came back was how long he would be stuck on Earth,
Okay.
though. The plan was for him to come back one time, do some good, go back to heaven, which is the field of reeds for Egyptians, the yarrow fields. Anyway, he did not realize or take into account that Earth has a way of corrupting even the purest soul. Just being on Earth is naturally corrupting. And so he now will have to become more pure again before he can actually become a Sahu again. So again, expansive story, 7 books, need them all.
Okay. Even just this one book, though, is a beautiful love story, and a very unusual one. Can you talk about
Mhm.
that a little bit?
Sure, let's talk about love. Yeah, so Albion struggles with certain things. He'll have to conquer certain things. He'll have to conquer guilt. He's riddled with guilt. He'll have to conquer discipline. He smokes and drinks far too much. And most tricky of all for him is that he has a very romantic nature. He has an unbridled romantic nature. Love is everything. A life without love is no life at all if you're Albion, okay? He doesn't hold himself back in that regard. However, one of these spiritual masteries is that he will have to give up the thing he loves most in the world, which in this case is this love affair. I can't say who the
Yeah,
partner is because
don't
it's
want
a
to ruin it.
spoiler,
Yeah.
but you learn in book 1 that he will have to walk away from this romance. And so for all 7 books, you should be feeling all of the tensions, the good kind and the bad kind. And there's no getting around it. You're not going to fool the universe,
Yeah.
right? He has to do it. Whether or not him and his lover get a happy ending, that's going to take me 7 books to get to. You're in good hands, though. I'll give you
I
that much.
I hope because I love Albion. Actually, I love your characters just generally.
Yeah,
I think it's interesting that as a gay man living in Edwardian times, he has to be a little bit obscure about his nature.
certainly. Yeah, at the time, if you were outed as a gay man in England, your choice was prison or suicide. Those were the options. So, of course, he's closeted. He has to be. And of course, one of the reasons that gay men left England and went to the various, vestiges of the empire was because they were a little further from the law in Egypt or in the Middle East at the time. It's different now, of course, but at the time they were a little more protected. So he is a little, he hides. He believes that he's hiding. But if you know Albion, you know that everyone knows.
Yeah.
Everyone knows. He really truly believes that he's hiding, but I will give him this much credit. When he is outed, which happens regularly,
Yeah.
when he is outed, he is always completely unapologetic about his sexuality.
Yeah.
And I think that we should talk about his sexuality a little more, simply because since I talked with you last, the book has made a lot of waves online,
Really.
good and bad.
Okay.
So I think we should talk about the three G's.
Okay.
The book is getting accused of three G's: gay, gratuitous, graphic. Okay. So this is my window to tell you whether or not the book is really all of those things. Of course, it's gay. It's not about being gay. It's completely normalized. He just is gay.
Yeah.
But sure, we'll call it gay. And then gratuitous. There's a lot of mixed opinions on whether or not this book is gratuitous. Gratuitous just means that you put sex in the book for the sake of putting sex in the book, which I did. Of course I did. But it's not gratuitous in the sense that it's graphic. So it does get accused of being graphic, but it is not. And in part, Kat, that's because he's an Edwardian.
Yeah.
He's the sole narrator of the book. He's writing to himself. He's creating an account of this life just in case he has to reincarnate again. He's got a full, thorough account of this life. So he's writing to himself, and so he can talk about his sexuality, but there's no reason for him to be graphic to himself.
Right.
He's just recounting certain things. And it's always very elegantly written. If anybody out there needs a tutorial on how to write sex so elegantly that you don't even know what's happening,
Yeah.
read my book, because I've had people come up to me and be like, it's almost too elegant. Like, I don't know what the physical actions are that are happening. I have to reread it a few times to get there. So, and anyway, in any case, I would say that Dead Egyptians is being treated a little unfairly online right now. And as much as I like the attention of people saying, your book is so spicy that I can't even read it, as much as I enjoy that, it's simply not true. It's
Well,
a
I
love
tell you
story.
what, I'm not I don't have anything against erotica, but it's not something that I typically pick up for myself. I don't consider this to be that at all.
I don't
Um,
either. I don't
I
either.
I ended up reading this book, you and I knew each other and I was just interested, but the the feeling that I got that it was exactly that. It was elegant. And as later when we talked about the sexuality aspect of it, I thought it's just part of the story. I don't think it's like how could you tell that story without that? It's not it's
Yes, thank you for saying that. You can't take the sex out of the book.
mm-mm,
If you took the sex out of Dead Egyptians, it would be like taking Egypt out of the book. It would all
exactly.
collapse. You can't do it. You can't take this book and set it in the American West. It is what it is.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. No, I agree with that. And I'm surprised that people are maybe it's the times,
It's
you know.
both ways, by the way. Some people are
Really?
like, it's so hot that I couldn't read it. I had to set it down, 1 star. And then there's these other peoples that are like, this isn't nearly hot enough, 1 star.
Do
Can't
you
make it.
think they were some of your readers were looking for like more like Indiana Jones?
Oh, yeah, thank you. That's another interesting point. Albion works for the Antiquities Service. He is not an archaeologist. I am an Egyptologist, not an archaeologist. He's exactly the same way. So, what's the difference? Archaeologists are tomb robbers with degrees. Okay. Their MO is to break into tombs, to take the treasure, to get it shipped back to Paris and London and New York. Albion is not that. He has to abide by a code that the dead Egyptians impose upon him. And so he cannot enter a tomb. He cannot view an unwrapped mummy. And so what he actually does for the Antiquities Service is he is a translator. He's a brilliant linguist. He can translate hieroglyphics and any number of other languages. And so he is very useful. But like in terms of archaeology books, Indiana Jones is one extreme. You've got a gun-toting, motorcycle riding action hero, okay? And it was actually very important to me that Albion was not that, because Indiana Jones is perfect. Raiders of the Lost Ark is a perfect film. I can't top it. I know that. I'm not even going to try. Okay. Also, I grew up in the 80s and 90s. In the 90s, I was in high school. And at the time, in order to be a hero in a film, you had to be an action hero. You had to kick ass. And I got really burned out on that. And I remember telling my friends, even in high school, like, you shouldn't have to exhibit violent tendencies to be the star. So Albion is not a warrior. He is actually not a magician either. There's a lot of magic in Dead Egyptians, but it's always somebody else's magic. Like Aleister Crowley has magic, or the Dead Egyptians have magic. There's a library that has, but it's not Albion's.
Yeah.
His skill set is just that he is a brilliant man. He can think his way out of any situation. He's also a very well-liked man. He's not a snob. He went to Cambridge. He's extremely well educated, but he's not a snob.
No.
He will talk to anybody that wants to talk to him. He doesn't care if they're young, old, Egyptian, British, rich, poor, male, female. He doesn't care about any of that. He genuinely is good with people, and so he can also talk himself out of any situation. That's his skill set.
I
Do you
was
remember?
actually
Sorry.
I was actually talking to a potential reader recently, and she saw that I had made a comment about the book, and she said, how would you describe this? And I
Mhm.
said, it's a love story. It's a story of a man's love for his country, for the people, for the culture, and even his culture that he's recently born into, as you know, unfair to him as they are. I think it's a love story.
That says thank you, thank you. It says a lot about Albion isn't anti-British.
No,
When he was French, he wasn't anti-French. Albion is very interested in educating himself always. He's not anti anybody. He
yeah,
simply has a mission, which is that Egyptians deserve to rule themselves. And he's not going to lose sight of that. But yeah, he can get along with anybody.
yeah, yeah. No, and which is, so I wasn't surprised in reading the book, and I guess it's a bit of a spoiler, but not much, that he is a Sahu at some point. That's not something that he's aware of originally, but it makes sense because he was so pure. So yeah, and that his whole reason for being in this situation is self-sacrifice. So yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah,
I liked it.
he didn't even know how much he was sacrificing. He thought, I'll sacrifice one lifetime for the cause. He had nobody knew it was going to be 2,000 years of foreign rule. Egypt was the greatest civilization the world had ever known. How could they possibly understand what they were in for? And they're
Absolutely.
so demoralized. That's the thing. They don't have a plan. They're completely demoralized. The living Egyptians are, of course, as are the dead Egyptians, even though they're very powerful. um, they have sort of been beaten into submission. And there is no plan, because until the living Egyptians understand that they have a chance at independence, and until they're willing to fight for their own independence, there really isn't anything to talk about. And in fact, in book one, it's just sort of, I just kind of plant a seed. But in book two, we really get into the Egyptian independence aspect of the story, because in book two, there were some serious incidences in 1905 and 1906 that spurred the revolution. And those are fun.
Yeah. So let's discuss Halloween a little bit. So there's no
Ooh.
mummies in this. However, we're both fans of the 1990s The Mummy.
Mm.
Why is the mummy always named Imhotep?
Imhotep. If you ask Nick Johnson, the narrator of the audiobook, he'll say, it's because it was so much fun to say. Im- Imhotep. No matter where you emphasize the syllable, it's always like a fun, powerful name to say. What Hollywood got right was that he was powerful man. So we got to talk about the three Imhoteps.
Okay.
Imhotep was a real person from history. He's also always the mummy in Hollywood mummy films, and then he's also a character in this book. Um, let's start with Hollywood. You mentioned 1999's The Mummy, which was a huge influence on me. Albion is very much like a Magi, but that's tangential. Um, Imhotep in Hollywood. The first Mummy movie was 1932's The Mummy. That was one of the Universal monster movies. Very, very good movie. If you haven't seen it, you'll be very impressed. It was before the censorship laws in the
Okay.
30s, so it was still pretty decadent. In any case, they called their mummy Imhotep because at the time they were excavating Saqqara
Oh,
in real life. They were digging up Saqqara for the first time. And so Imhotep actually was the hot topic in Egyptology in 1932. So that first film just was like, okay, he's the new King Tut. He's what everybody's talking about. Fine. And then afterwards, Hollywood, they always homage their own history. So they just homage their own history. And he's always Imhotep and he's always a powerful priest, which is true. Let's talk about the real Imhotep. He was
okay.
a real guy. Most people know him because he built the first pyramid in Egypt. But he's actually a lot more than that. So I'm going to read you his actual titles,
Okay.
okay? His real titles: Administrator of the Palace, Chief Sculptor, Chief Architect, Chief Builder, Chief Counselor, Chief Physician, Overseer of the House of Works, High Priest of the House of Ra, Keeper of the Royal Seal, Vizier. He
Wow.
was so powerful. Keeper of the Royal Seal, what that means is he could act as the king. He could act
Wow.
as the pharaoh. That's how powerful he was. So you could remember him as second to the king. You could remember him as a Da Vinci-like man that mastered many trades. You could remember him for the pyramid. But here's the most interesting thing about the real guy. He was worshipped as a god by the Egyptians. After he died, he was deified. So to this day, you can go to Egypt and you can visit Imhotep chapels where they worshipped him. He was one of only two commoners that ever became deified in ancient
Wow.
Egypt. So the famous one is at Kamombo. It's a crocodile temple, but if you go behind the crocodile bit, there's an Imhotep chapel back there. And he was actually worshipped for his wisdom. He's kind of like the father of all things Egyptian. And very specifically, the pyramid is never mentioned. This is what's so fascinating. They never even talk about the architecture. They worshipped him because of his skills as a physician. So you can see the carvings are of all of the medical instruments that were attributed to him. He invented the forceps, he invented the scalpel. He was an innovator medically, and the Egyptians were so grateful to him just for that, that they gave him the highest honors that could possibly be bestowed.
I don't think that a lot of modern readers understand, even if you're studying, or well, such as it is, if you have an interest in Egypt, I don't think people understand how sophisticated they were technologically, mathematically, medically, but there was a lot of that.
We cannot do the things that the ancient
No,
Egyptians did still to this day. We can't build the Great Pyramid. A guy tried. He tried to make a model scale of it using the technology that he knew they had.
yeah,
We actually know what tools they had. Please don't ever talk about aliens built the pyramids to me, because
no,
we know it was Egyptians.
that would be really, I think it's disrespectful to even bring
It's
that up
it's
because,
actually racist.
yeah, it
I
is.
mean, nobody thinks about that aspect of it, but I consider it a racist
It
statement.
is actually.
You're saying because Europeans couldn't build
Right.
pyramids, or
There
we
you
can't
go.
build them now, it meant that Egyptians couldn't do it. But we know that the Egyptians built the pyramids. We have the letters that the workers wrote to their families. We have the tools as well. There was a pyramid built around the same time, that they didn't finish it. And so they left all of the tools inside and they just kind of sealed it and walked away. So, we know what they had. And this guy was like, I'll just build a scale version of it using a scale version of all the tools. Couldn't do it. He couldn't
Yeah.
figure it out. And there are also, this is going to sound really extreme. I don't know what they did. I wasn't there. But there are places in Egypt that when I look at them, I'm like, the only way to build this would be to melt stone into place, melt it. We can't do that.
Yeah.
And I can't think of any other way how they could have done it. So yes, of course, we owe them a great debt. Of course, this is a huge field that everybody should study. Why are we studying? Oh, who should I throw under the bus, Kat?
I know. Well, my
Why do
actual
we
first,
study the founding fathers when we can study books?
exactly. No, my actual first, well, I was always interested in Egypt, but one of the books that I read, and I know that it's controversial, but I was in a book club and I ended up with A God Against the Gods and Return to Thebes. And it was about the time that the Tut mummy was making its way around. And I thought, I just had no idea who this guy was. And so I started reading this book, and it was written as if it was true. It was written as if somebody was there. I don't know if you've read it, but he got a lot of things wrong. But it was also done
Oh,
in such a way that you they were suddenly people. And so
yeah.
then I started becoming interested in, well, who were these people? What was this whole little fight about which gods are the good gods? What was that about? And it was not something that I thought about until I
Was
read the book.
this was this fiction, or was this somebody that like claimed to remember their past life in ancient
It was
Egypt?
written as fiction,
Yeah.
but he was an Egyptologist. I will send you the name of the author. It might even be
Yeah.
out of print by now. It
Okay.
was a two-book thing, and it was in some book club,
Yeah.
book was the book of the month, and I got it for like $1 or something. I don't know. But it was one of the most interesting things I ever read, not because it was accurate and not because it was particularly well done, but because it was the first time I had ever I read a book about it as it was fiction, but it was written as if I was there and I was a fly on the wall. And
That's right.
yeah, it was just an interesting way of looking at things. While we're on
I
that subject, we need to talk about Aleister Crowley because you don't treat him the way
Okay, you
anybody
want to
does.
talk about Alistair? Is it because it's Halloween? Is that where you're
Yeah,
at?
that's it.
Or are you just a fan? He
No,
has
I'm
so
not a
many
fan.
fans to this day. Okay, let's talk about Alistair Crowley.
Okay.
Nick Johnson, you remember him, narrator of the audiobook.
Yeah.
He said to me, I'm not going to do the accent because I respect him too much. He said to me, I've read a lot of books about Aleister Crowley. Yours is the only one
Yes.
that doesn't make him evil.
Yes.
And so let's look at the facts. Alice, a lot of people that were associated with Aleister Crowley met really strange, horrible deaths, or were ruined, or were ostracized. There's a trail of bodies, not that he killed them, but by association with him, they would lose their lives in crazy ways.
Yeah.
He had traits that were horrifying, like he's super sexist, for one example. But I didn't make him pure evil. The choice was, is Aleister Crowley the root of the evil, or was he susceptible to the actual cause of the evil? I painted him as a very brilliant bohemian that was susceptible to evil rather than the cause of it. The reason I did that is because I read Confessions of Aleister Crowley, and even though there were things that horrified me, I had to give him some credit for the way that the book is written. He lived his life very openly. In the introduction, he says a lot about, I am writing this book without any kind of moral reflection. I am just giving you a thorough account of everything that happened. You can make your own judgment. I'm not going to do it. Here we go. And he's so open. He never denies culpability. If he really did the thing that he's accused of doing, he admits it, and He gives you a very thorough explanation of why he did it. And he is a brilliant man. You cannot deny that this man was not brilliant. He was very ahead of his time, not always. Like when he's sexist, he's like a creature of his time.
Yeah.
But in other ways, when he is ahead of the game, it's absolutely remarkable. So yes, I guess I was soft on him. Um, and we'll see the consequences of that decision as the books go on, I suppose.
I thought it was really good to do that. My I was interested that this is the way you dealt with him, but I also thought, well, I mean, we don't know what's in someone's head, and if you've read something that he personally wrote, well, then you probably have a better balanced, idea of who he might have been. And we're
It's a
all
really
products of our
fascinating
time.
it's a really fascinating book. You shouldn't read it because you think that you're going to join his
Oh no.
religion, Thelema. You shouldn't read. I mean, you can just read it as a time capsule.
Yeah,
Read it for the language of the era. Read it for the ideas that he had, which are, it feels like it's the first time in history that anyone has ever had that thought,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
So just read it.
yeah. That's that's great. I like that. I
It's
will
the
probably
size of
read it.
War and Peace. It's not like
Yeah,
something you can tackle in an evening, but
yeah.
it's fascinating.
So, can you tell the listeners a little bit about how you went about researching this book? Obviously, it's something that you do.
Yeah, yeah, historical accuracy was really important to me. So I had this idea. I wanted the whole first draft complete before I went to Egypt,
Okay.
which was dumb. Why did I? It's dumb, right? So thankfully that's not how it worked out. I had written all of the like 1902 scenes, and then I got on a flight and I went to Egypt to fact check myself. So in the end, I took 5 research trips to Egypt. I'm very fortunate that I was able to do 5 research trips. So in the first one, it was really interesting where I was validated. Like I had held these ideas about who Egyptians were for so long, and in some cases, I was completely validated in all of my instincts. And then in these other cases, I was mistaken, but I got to fact check myself and correct myself. So yeah, everyone should go to Egypt. It is truly a land of wonders. I feel this is going to sound woo woo-y, but I feel a sense of magic in the air when I'm in Egypt, as if I'm supposed to be there. And I'm like a puppet being controlled by Egypt. And my job is just to follow the will of Egypt and write it all down and throw it out into the world. And regardless of whether or not that's a woo woo idea, um, you can't deny that Egypt is the land of wonders and it was
Yeah.
endlessly rewarding to be
It's
able to
very
visit.
mystical. And well, and
Yeah,
this is a woo-woo month, so that's okay. We can be as woo-woo as we
true.
want.
I get away with this in
Yes,
October.
absolutely. Well, Dell, I want to thank you very much for coming on and finding the time for this. And readers, as always, you can find the links to our guests and down in the description so you can learn more about her projects and her passions. And please, if you do read Dead Egyptians, and I sure do recommend that, and you like it, I did, please leave a review. You don't have to write a lot. You can just put some stars if that's all you have time for. That's the literary version of like and subscribe. And on that note, please like and subscribe Writer to Writer if you haven't already, so you'll never miss another episode, but also so we can continue showcasing new authors for you to discover. Dell, it was great. Always great to talk to you.
Thank you, you too.
Thanks.